Hanson-Young.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I move the motion to disallow the Code of Behaviour regulations as listed on the notice paper today. This list of behaviour protocols, this is a regulation that was flagged by the Tony Abbott coalition prior to the last election. We've known about it for quite some time. Doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it okay to start segregating different groups of people and saying that some people have to abide by different laws than others. The ridiculous thing about this protocol, Mr Deputy President, is that it is simply listing what are basic understandings of what law-abiding citizens in this country should be doing anyway. But of course, this isn't about practicality. This isn't about adding anything to the needs of asylum seekers or indeed the safety of the community. This is all about vilification of asylum seekers and refugees. This Code of Behaviour states that individuals must not disobey road rules, commit sexual offences, commit any criminal activity, harass, intimidate, bully or engage in any other antisocial or disruptive behaviour. Well, Mr Deputy President, I'd hope that no one out there in the community would be participating in these types of activities. But the whole idea of needing a code of behaviour just for someone who is on a bridging visa because they arrived by boat is absolutely ludicrous. And when this policy was announced by Mr Morrison, the coalition spokesperson on this issue, and now, of course, the Minister for Immigration, it was laughed at. This piece of policy and this regulation, and not just laughed at, but held up as what a pathetic attempt to try and divide and drive a divisive wedge into the Australian community. And it was none other than Dennis Shanahan, Mr Deputy President, who, as of course we all know, one of Australia's most conservative commentators, saying that these protocols were a load of, quote, nonsense. And I must say, if Mr Shanahan has a problem with this, you must think, well, it's probably gone way, way too far. Mr Shanahan said, I think this is a bridge too far from the coalition. I don't think you can suggest that everybody should have a warning attached to them. What are they supposed to wear? A scarlet letter A for asylum seeker. I mean, that is the precise point here, Mr Deputy President, that the coalition are so obsessed with hating asylum seekers and refugees, so obsessed with whipping up fear about these vulnerable people just because of the mode of which they reach Australia, that they come up with a list of protocols to say to the rest of the Australian people, no, asylum seekers are all so bad, we have to have a whole new set of laws just to manage their behaviour. I mean, what an outrageous slur on the thousands and thousands of people who have come to this country over generations as asylum seekers and refugees and settled in this country peacefully, cooperatively, and have done so with the very real commitment of contributing to our great nation. And the idea that we have to have, in order to satisfy Tony Abbott and Mr Morrison's fear-mongering on asylum seekers and refugees, that we have to have a special protocol to tell people to abide by the law is beyond me. It is, Mr Deputy President, and I don't step back from this at all. This is about vilifying a group of people because of who they are, where they've come from and how they arrived. That is all this is. This is about fear-mongering from the Minister of Tony Abbott's government. Now, this is, of course, the Code of Behaviour. It's one page. and you have to sign your name and agree that you won't do any of these what are considered to be antisocial activities, and that you'll, of course, abide by the Australian law. Well, you know, the ridiculous thing about this, Mr. Deputy President, is if somebody breaks the law, we have an Australian criminal justice system that deals with it. And, you know, deals with most lawbreakers pretty well, whether you've been born here or not. The whole idea of having a special set of laws is to send a message to those out in the electorate that the coalition like pushing their buttons and saying asylum seekers and refugees should be feared, that they are bad people, and they're so bad we had to come up with a whole new set of laws to manage their behaviour. I mean, what a load of nonsense, as Dennis Shanahan so rightly put it. But of course there are members within the coalition's own ranks who can already see that this is an appalling abuse, not just of government authority in the form of being able to put forward legislations that control people's lives and send very dangerous messages out to the electorate. There are many in the coalition who are sickened by how low this government has been prepared to go when it comes to asylum seekers and refugee policy. Russell Broadbent said, quote, "There should never be special categories of laws for different categories of people. The rule of law should apply to all, and we should not set some people apart. This kind of vilification of asylum seekers is unacceptable in this nation." Well, I couldn't agree more with Mr Broadbent on that matter. And it is outrageous to see how low, how far down the bottom of the barrel this government is prepared to go to peddle their fear-mongering, to peddle their dog whistle. And some people would probably say this isn't even a dog whistle, Mr Deputy President. This is a pretty loud and clear trumpeting of fear-mongering by this government. It is deliberately inciting fear about asylum seekers who are living in the Australian community. And, you know, the saddest thing about all of this, Mr Deputy President, is that those who are continuing to live on bridging visas in the Australian community are terrified themselves of what will happen next. And why? That's because this government continues to hold over their head the constant threat of sending them back to their countries, where they will face the types of inhumane brutality, the torture that they've fled. And we know that a number of these individuals have been so distressed by this circumstance that, sadly, Mr Deputy President, they've taken their own lives. Now, that's not something that should be taken lightly. It's something that this government should be reflecting on, that their policies are pushing vulnerable individuals who have fled some of the worst atrocities and regimes in the world to come to Australia asking for help. And we have government policy that is pushing them to the point of self-destruction and even, sadly, suicide. We know that there's been one man in recent weeks who set himself on fire, and died as a result of the horrific burns to his body. Now, that young man was so desperate not to be returned home back to Sri Lanka at the hands of what he believed were his torturers, that he set himself on fire in order not to have to go home. Now, rather than putting forward these ridiculous, fear-mongering, insulting, vilification-driven code of behaviour protocols, this government should be focusing on what is wrong with their policy that pushes an individual to a point of setting themselves on fire in order to take their own lives so that they don't have to be subjected to the awful tortures and persecution that they believe waits them at home. It's beyond me, Mr Deputy President, why this government thinks it is important to continue to peddle the myths and fear around asylum seekers and refugees. We have one of the world's best and thorough assessment processes if we do it properly. We determine whether somebody is a refugee. We should have a review process to whether, if they are rejected, there needs to be an appeals process. And in all of that, you can be treating people humanely. You don't have to be treating them like they're animals or indeed as if they're criminals, Mr Deputy President. And of course, there is nothing illegal to seeking asylum. I know Mr Morrison has directed all of his public servants to use the word illegal. That doesn't make it so, Mr Deputy President. In fact, there is not one thing in the Migration Act by which this minister is responsible that says that just because you're an asylum seeker or a refugee that you are somehow illegal. The word illegal does not appear in the Migration Act in relation to asylum seekers and refugees. And yet this minister, the Prime Minister, Mr Abbott, are determined to continue a fear-mongering campaign against some of the world's most vulnerable people. And why is that, Mr Deputy President? Well, I tell you why. Because they are obsessed with the idea of this issue winning them cheap, dirty votes. That's what this is all about, Mr Deputy President. This is the vilification of one group of people to satisfy their own electoral achievements. We've seen it happen before, and it's as if the coalition just cannot help themselves when it comes to being given the power to manage Australia's immigration policies. We have a government that detains children on a remote island in a prison, in a tented prison in the middle of a phosphate mine, and they think that that is acceptable. We have a government that is now detaining children on a prison ship out on the high seas, and they won't even speak about it, not just in this place and not outside to the Australian people. We have a government and a Prime Minister who says that when there are cries of help and desperation from mothers locked up, detained in the Christmas Island detention centre, we have a Prime Minister who accuses them of moral blackmail. And this is how low this government is prepared to go when it comes to dismissing the very genuine needs and concerns of refugees who come to this country, but how low they're prepared to go to vilify that group of people. I must say, last week when the Prime Minister accused refugee mothers who are struggling with the pressures of being a parent for their children, particularly young children, newborn babies, who are incarcerated in the Christmas Island detention camp, to turn around and accuse them of moral blackmail was pretty much the lowest thing I've seen from this Prime Minister yet. But, Mr Deputy President, I must say I'm not holding my breath. I assume that once he's on a roll, this is where it's going to go. Of course, only a few weeks ago we had Mr Morrison, the Immigration Minister from the other place, stand up in question time and say the coalition hadn't even warmed up yet when it came to their policy on refugees and asylum seekers. Well, God help us if this is not warmed up. What is next, Mr Deputy President? We have vilification in relation to the Code of Behaviour rules. We have hundreds of children incarcerated indefinitely, and we have a Prime Minister who accuses desperate, mentally scarred mothers of moral blackmail. Well, I tell you, Mr Deputy President, hard to be morally blackmailed if you're morally bankrupt. And that is what is wrong with this government. They have no concept of how to run an immigration policy that looks after people, that has the care and dedication and compassion that is needed. They don't care about compassion, Mr Deputy President. They don't even care about proper process or the rule of law. All they care about is being able to set their agenda of fear and hate. And that's what this government continues to do over and over again. And the really disappointing thing about this particular debate tonight on this particular issue is that, of course, despite all the concern in relation to this issue last year when this code of behaviour was first mooted by Mr Morrison and Mr Abbott, I'm extremely disappointed that the Australian Labor Party will be voting against this disallowance motion, simply giving the tick and flick to this type of vilification. Now, I hope I'm wrong on that, and I hope I've been misinformed that perhaps the Labor Party will indeed vote to rid this scourge from our statute books. But I don't hold my breath. And I'll be interested to see from the members of the Labor Party exactly why they believe that this code of behaviour should continue. Because if we're going to have a code of behaviour that is in addition to and separate to the basic rule of law for one group of people, where to next? Who's the next group of vulnerable people that the government of the day wants to start picking on? Will it be the members of the Indigenous community? Maybe just Indigenous kids, or single mothers, or those who are accessing the disability pension. I mean, at what point do we say we're just going to have separate behaviour protocols for every different group of people because that's the way the government wants to control the lawmaking in this country? Or do we stand up and we say, well, there is the rule of law which all of us equally are expected to abide by, and if you don't abide by it, then there is a criminal justice system to deal with you. Now, I just want to reflect in these last minutes of my contribution tonight, Mr Deputy President, the comments made by Dennis Shanahan ring a very eerie truth to them. And I want to read them out again just so that we can be clear. I don't think you can suggest that everybody should have some warning attached to them. What are they supposed to wear? A scarlet letter A for asylum seekers. Now, those comments weren't made lightly, Mr Deputy President. It was made in direct relation to where this type of attitude goes and the slippery slope of allowing vilification to be rubber-stamped by a Chamber of Parliament just because the government of the day wants to continue to whip up fear and to blow their dog whistle. We know that this issue of immigration is consistently used by governments of the day and indeed oppositions to garner electoral support, and it's about kicking the people who have no opportunity but to speak for themselves. This is about pushing issues and blame to a small group of people who have not done anything wrong but have no voice in order to speak up and say no, to stand up for themselves. And in this place, our job as elected members of Parliament is to debate issues, take on board what it is that the government of the day would like to do, but to stand up for the rights of people in our country to be treated fairly and equally. And I don't think for one moment that it is this chamber's job to rubber stamp and tick and flick the fear-mongering agenda of the government of the day, or a list of behaviour protocols that do nothing more than vilify a group of people because of who they are, where they come from, or how they arrived. This is playing the race card, Mr Deputy President, and it's appalling, and this chamber should kick it out and we should be kicking it out tonight and not standing for this type of behaviour or this attitude from the government. This is Scott Morrison and Tony Abbott's fear-mongering agenda, and the Labor Party and the crossbenchers should reject it.